We were soon to know, for through our telescopic lenses we saw the grey waters suddenly heave as the monster cut through them with lightning speed. Climatic conditions, exposure, day and night, and stormy weather affected our film, which accounts for the initial result. But this is unimportant in comparison to the achievement of filming the monster itself for the first time in history.
And what would you say if I told you the Loch Ness Monster was real? Now you probably think I'm insane, but in this film I'll be diving deep into the possibility of it surviving, of it and existing, of course. So throughout this documentary I'll be having several interviews with Dr. Rob Patchett, who is a marine biologist doctor, so we can finally find out the truth, whether it is real or not, and finally uncover this 100 years old mystery of the Loch Ness Monster being real. Of sort of thing is. Do you believe in the Loch Ness Monster? Like genuinely?
Not in the traditional sense. I would say I'm on the side that it's incredibly unlikely that the Loch Ness Monster that people imagine exists.
Okay. So my question was, what is your opinion on like the Loch Ness Monster, and can you see that people believe it's a thing, or is it just completely out for you?
I think something, like, I can understand from like a myth point of view that, you know, people, so that the myth itself, you know, people believe in that, and therefore Loch Ness Monster as a myth exists, but in reality, does a monster live in Loch Ness? It's so unlikely that I'd be on the side of arguing that the Loch Ness Monster that most people imagine doesn't exist. However, you could argue that there's something that looks like a monster that lives in Loch Ness, like a large eel or something like that. So in terms of the myth, I think I'm on the side that it is actually something that people imagine and perceive rather than something that actually exists, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, got that. What would you say about all the newspaper articles and things that like show? Do you think that's just like made up, or?
So a lot of the articles. So I'm not. Firstly, I'm not like that familiar with all the specific articles, but I know there are some classic images of Loch Ness Monster that have been reported
like
over the years. And I think
the surgeon one.
Sorry?
The surgeon one's the most famous one, like off the front of the newspaper from like 1930.
Yeah. Yeah, so that classic one, the classic image that was reported in that people are familiar with, I think wasn't that proven? You might correct me if I'm wrong, but hasn't that been proven to be a set, or suggested that it was highly likely that it was a setup? So I think for a lot of the I think with myths in general, I think you have to be a little bit careful because there are often hoaxes. So people want to set something up that matches what people expect of the myth. So in terms of the Loch Ness Monster, you would try to create something that has like a long neck and sort of emerging from the water or whatever, and try to capture that image. So I think there's, with a lot of the myths and that style of story, there's a lot of potential for hoaxes, but there's also a lot of potential for people seeing something that matches what they expect to see in the context of a myth, but is actually something else. So I don't know, it could be something floating in the water or whatever. The particular case you're on about, I have no idea. The possibility of like the neck of actually existing. In a way, it leaves the possibility that it wasn't a hoax, because you can't confirm it either way. So, but what I would say, if it was an animal that needs to breathe air, for example, you'd expect a lot of people, you'd expect to see it more often than is reported. You would expect to see it quite often because it's coming up to breathe. People have done studies on the Loch Ness Monster. They've looked for DNA and not found anything. There's a claim that, I think people claim that it's a type of, like a dinosaur, plesiosaur.
Yeah, that's one of my notes here.
Which would have, I'm not sure on the exact period in history that they were around, but it would have been tens of millions of years ago in terms of the fossil record.
Yeah.
So again, it's unlikely that just based on that, it's unlikely that either an individual or a small population of plesiosaurs have existed through time in that one location. And so from an ecologist's perspective, which is the sort of perspective I guess I would take on it, you have to think that for population of animals to survive over a long time, there needs to be a viable population, i.e. they need to be able to reproduce and to maintain that population. So yeah, from a science perspective, I think that you would always come to the conclusion that the Loch Ness Monster is a myth rather than a fact than something that actually exists in reality.
Yes. Back onto the plesiosaur topic. I've got a few notes here about that. As one of the questions, I put, could it be the last of its kind, the last plesiosaur? Is it possible for it to?
I would say it's extremely unlikely for the reasons I mentioned, because if you think about a species that was common tens of millions of years ago, it would be really unlikely. It would be impossible for one individual to persist over that time. You'd have to have a population that's able to reproduce over that time period. And in fact, over that time period, I imagine that, Loch Ness itself has probably come and gone, and all these sort of things, with glacial periods coming and going, and all this sort of stuff. So, yeah, it's unlikely. I'm still holding that it's a myth rather than something that actually exists.
Okay. Yes. So I've got another similar sort of question, but I know you're into marine biology and stuff. Is that correct?
I don't do marine biology, but I work with birds mainly, but I can have a go at answering.
All right. So I've got a question. Is it possible for any sort of living organism of this size that people are saying it is, to survive in the loch for so long, or would it have to emigrate out of the actual loch? 'Cause I think there's a way you can get out of it. It's not like a closed area.
The answer is I'm not sure. What I would imagine is an animal of that size could probably survive in in a body of water the size of Loch Ness. If you think about, so what it would need is, just to survive and not reproduce or anything like that, it just needs enough, it would just need enough food resource to survive, and I could imagine that that's possible for a large animal in a body of a water body the size of Loch Ness. If you think about captive animals, so they as long as there's food, they are available. It is possible that they, so as long as there's food available, it is possible that they survive in some quite small environments. But that to me is not. I'm still not using that as an argument for its whether it exists or not.
Right. Yeah. Well, most of my questions are that it does exist, if that makes sense. Like, so it'd be good to get a second opinion, like, which is what this is. I have. Is it possible for a do you think if it was real, it would have been able to survive? There'd be more than just one.
Yeah, I think. Well, if a species existed in one place like that and had persisted over tens of millions of years while the rest of its species had become extinct, and this was like let's hypothetically imagine it had, there would need to be a viable population, which would be, a viable population would be more than a couple of individuals, for example. So you'd have to have a number of individuals for a population to survive over time. People could work out like what the viable population size for an animal of that size would be. I'm not sure what it would be, but it would be more than two, and would probably need a lot. So for a population, they probably would need a larger body of water than Loch Ness.
Okay, so I think so. You're against it being a real thing.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
So
If you have to pin me down, I'm going to say if I had to decide today, I'm going to say the Loch Ness monster doesn't exist, which is a bit of a boring answer because obviously, things like the Loch Ness monster capture people's imagination, and I don't want to. What I think is a myth can exist.
Right.
So the image can exist, but no one's ever going to find the Loch Ness monster because I don't think the Loch Ness monster physically exists. So it's a bit of a boring answer in a way. But.
Okay, it's all right. Another one of the questions I've got is that there's sightings. So it's got there's like a huge countless conspiracy theories about it being real and such,
Okay.
but they're global. So it's not just in Scotland, because people say they see stuff like it in, I think there's one in Puerto Rico and Africa and stuff. Do you think there's any similar creature out there that's not been discovered yet that it could be?
So I think there are creatures that we haven't discovered yet. In fact, that there just will be, especially in the depths of the ocean. Let's say there'll be all sorts of species that we haven't discovered yet. However, and it's not impossible that in a large body of water that there is a species that hasn't been described yet, but it's not the Loch Ness monster. That is not on that scale. So I don't think. I wish I was an expert on this, so I'd have a good answer for you. But basically, I think a lot of stories are quite common across, and start independently as well, that focus on mythical creatures and beings. And I don't know what the origin of that of those stories is, but I'm sure there's a body of literature on that, on how these things start, or where they originate from, and whether it's a single origin of the story that's branched out, or whether it's they've started independently. So I think it's possible for similar myths to emerge in different places, and especially something like a body of water and the ocean. You can't, there's so much potential for one to imagine a creature in there, in the depths of the water, somewhere you can't see or explore, but your mind can conjure up some image and explain stuff that perhaps seems a bit odd at the time. So let's say you see something in the water, maybe it's a monster, or maybe it was a log floating by. There's lots that the human mind's always going to be quite imaginative, and so I suspect that. And I don't know anything about any of the other stories you mentioned, but I imagine that it's entirely possible that very similar myths have emerged in different places.
Okay, so we've gone through these questions really quick, actually.
There's no worries. No worries.
Yeah. My last few questions now. Can you see why people might believe it is real?
Yeah, I think myths. So yeah, myths in general. I can see why people want to believe them, even if it's incredibly unlikely, and all of the evidence points towards them, or the strong evidence pointing towards a myth being a myth rather than something that exists. And a myth, by definition, suggests to me something that is probably not true. In a way, it's a sort of, a myth to me is a story rather than something tangible that you can go and see. So I think the human nature is such that we like stories that sometimes seem hard to believe from like an escapism perspective, perhaps. I think it's sometimes nice to think that there's stuff out there we don't know, and there's loads we don't know. But I think it's natural for us to enjoy these sort of stories, and perhaps in the past, when these stories first emerged, there was a lot less evidence or a lot less access to information to critique the stories. You might just hear the stories, and they've been passed down through the generations, and then they developed their own thing. They become a story that's part of culture, and we all know what the Loch Ness Monster is. So it's at least when we say I know, we all know that of the Loch Ness Monster in terms of its myth and status as a story and a myth. No one knows if it actually exists. It's just unlikely that it exists.
Yeah, it's because I've got another interview planned with someone else, and this guy's lived actually on the loch for the past like 30 years, trying to hunt it and stuff, and he says he's seen it like a few times. What do you think to that? Like, do you think that's real, or?
I'm definitely not going to argue with someone who's, I'd love to hear what they say, but I'm not so passionate that I'm gonna. I would listen to someone's account, and but I personally wouldn't. If they believe they've seen it, I'm not going to criticise and suggest they haven't. That's just my take on it. So yeah, as someone who if I'd seen the Loch Ness Monster, I might think differently, because I'd have different. Although I would be trying to work out what's called a parsimonious explanation, which just means that what is it most likely to be, and it's pretty unlikely for the reasons we've been discussing, that it's an animal that existed 65 million years ago, something like that. So I'd probably be critiquing what I've seen, but I get that people have a different opinion, and that's fine. I mean, I definitely don't. I'd be interested to hear other people's accounts, and I would respect them.
Okay, so there's this is the last sort of question now. So there's one of the newspaper articles suggested that it could be like an abnormally large trout from the Loch Ness. Is that something you can like wrap your head around, like thinking it's real? Like abnormally large fish?
So yeah,
Or-
like if someone sees something that, and they're not, to me, it's way more likely that it's a large eel or a large, extant animal. So that
Yeah.
means one that's not. So an animal that's not extinct, something that we know exists and is a particularly large version of it. Yeah, that to me would be a way more likely explanation. And in that, if you said to me, the Loch Ness Monster is actually a massive eel that's just not been able to escape from the loch and it's grown and grown and grown, I'd go, yeah, the Loch Ness Monster exists, but it's an eel,
Yeah.
not a plesiosaur. Do you see what I mean? So I think it could be that sort of thing. But then I have seen large eels that have been trapped on inland water bodies, and they do grow large.
Yeah.
So I could see how, if you saw that, you might think you've seen the Loch Ness Monster, but it was actually a large fish or eel or something. Totally. Yeah, that's totally plausible.
Yes, because I was reading a news article when I was doing research for this, and apparently someone's in Loch Ness. There's a lot of giant eels that swim about there. So do you think that it could potentially be an eel that they saw on the newspaper articles rather than a monster or something?
Yeah, I mean, that to me seems a more likely explanation. But I also think that people do hoaxes for the Loch Ness Monster. I haven't looked, but I bet you can find some obvious hoaxes as well.
Yeah, there's
Where people
a
have
few.
made a hoax. So you've got, like, I think sometimes there's a hoax, sometimes they've seen something. It's not a hoax, as in they've seen someone's genuinely seen something, but it would be better explained by it being an eel or something like that. But that doesn't say you could also argue in that case the Loch Ness Monster exists, but as I said, it's something. It's not.
Yeah,
it's just not what people imagine it is. It's just a big eel or something like that. Yeah, you could definitely use that as an explanation.
Okay, so I think I might have said this one before, but what do you think to all the different conspiracy theories about there's something living in there that's not an actual animal? I think you said that it's like a not real.
So what do you mean by not an animal?
Like it's not a known species.
Yeah, I mean it's unlikely. It's very unlikely because if so it's a species that we just don't know about yet or something like that. It's just so unlikely that, as I said, for it to survive over a long period of time, it's going to have needed more than one individual to reproduce over the lifespan that you'd expect of that individual to so basically that individual, if one individual has existed in there, if the argument is that one individual has lived there for a long time, you've got to think about what's the lifespan of an animal of that sort of size. Let's say it's 100 years. So it needs to be, how did it, you need to think, how did that population, where did that individual come from? There must have been a population prior to it that was able to reproduce and produce that last living example of that unknown species. So I just think it's incredibly unlikely on the timescales we're thinking about, which is, I think the Loch Ness Monster is probably, the Loch Ness itself is probably in the order of thousands of years. Also prior to 10,000 years, there wasn't a Loch Ness to talk about because of the Ice Age. So it has to be something that could have found its way into that body of water in the meantime, and then persisted for as long as the myth's been around, which I don't know how long it's been around. So if you start thinking along those lines, it's possible that you could always make an argument for something of somehow getting into the Loch Ness 100 years ago and it being the last of its kind, but it's just it just seems really unlikely. Yeah, I hope that's answering the question.
Okay, alright, thank you. And one last thing. So, do you think there could be like over time, the land could have formed around Loch Ness to make it, but there could have been a creature that has gone in and out and bred inside Loch Ness?
I don't know how Loch Ness works in terms of how it's connected to the sea, basically. So I don't know. I mean, if it's possible, I mean, presumably there's rivers and lochs and sort of like canal locks that connect Loch Ness to. Is it the Grand Canal that was that's connected to one end of Loch Ness? I forget what it's called, but anyway.
Yeah.
You know, so if someone has if you have a look and see, you know, you could find out yourself. I don't know off the top of my head, but you know, is there a way in and out of Loch Ness that before, you know, that wasn't created by humans in terms of making sort of navigable waterway for boats and stuff like that? So yeah, I mean, it is possible. It's just unlikely. And off the top of my head, I don't know, because I'm not familiar with the sort of workings of Loch Ness itself.
Okay then. I think that's about it then for my questions.
Bill, what do you think? What do you think about the Loch Ness monster?
I'm in mixed opinions about it because originally I thought it wasn't. Originally, when I was like little, I thought it wasn't real, but then as I've been doing more research for this, I'm starting to think, oh, it could be, you know. But then I thought it could have been a plesiosaur, but it's like I'm now like confirmed that it's probably not anything real.
Yeah.
I think it could be a large fish though, a large eel or something.
Yeah. Yeah. The thing with myths is, you know, it's impossible to completely disprove something. I mean, you know, especially, so that's the same with when you look at all your other myths you're interested in. I mean, you'll probably find some things that are common between all the different myths that you've talked about, or that you mentioned at the beginning, that it could be, you know, there's always the possibility that they exist. It might just be that it's really unlikely. And so sometimes science is often about, like a scientific perspective is often quite critical and see. So often you can say if something does exist, but it's quite hard to be 100% sure that something doesn't exist. It's just, then you think about probabilities and you look at the evidence, and the overwhelming evidence would be that the Loch Ness monster does not exist.
Yeah.
But to someone who believes in the Loch Ness monster, that leaves room for them to go, okay, well, they're not sure. They're just, you know, they just said it's highly likely that it doesn't exist. So, or they're almost certain that it doesn't exist. That's just a scientific speak in a way. Because you can never. Sometimes you can be. Depends what your question is, but you can be sometimes sure that, you know, you're sure that there's a bottle of water in front of you.
Yeah.
But sometimes you can't be sure if something doesn't exist. It's just like really likely, and I think that leaves the possibility open for people who want to believe that the Loch Ness monster is a plesiosaur or something like that. And I don't think that. I mean, from my perspective, that doesn't matter. I mean, people can believe what they want to believe, and I think it's interesting. I hope I'll be really interested to hear. I guess I'll hear from Mike at some point how it all goes. But I'm interested to hear what the people who have seen the Loch Ness monster sort of, you know, how they explain it and describe what they've seen and all that sort of stuff. I mean, if I was listening to their story, I would be like, oh, it was an eel. I just listened to their story.
Yeah.